People often say being a twin means being the same. But when you are mirror twins, one straight, one gay being the same is a myth that can shatter before you even understand it. Eliot Hartman had always felt that invisible split, even in childhood. He was the one who felt music before it was played, who saw color in shadows, who designed worlds in his sketchbook when others only saw blank paper. Reid Hartman, his reflection, was everything the family wanted right-handed, steady-eyed, with a future already planned by the time he was 12. Their father, a man carved from discipline and old rules, liked it that way. Their mother, caught between loyalty and peace, smiled in the kitchen but rarely challenged her husband's word. Eliot's difference wasn't something he could hide. By the time he was a teenager, he'd begun sketching costumes for school plays, spending hours in the art room long after class ended. It was there at 15 that he found a flyer for an art showcase. He'd been chosen to design the entire set for a youth theater piece. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was proof that he could belong somewhere. But that belief ended one evening in the living room. The air thick with the scent of vanilla candles his mother lit for guests they never had. His father stood between him and the front door, eyes locked on the outfit Eliot had chosen for rehearsal: loose linen trousers, a silk shirt in soft rose. "You're not leaving this house dressed like that," his father said, voice low but hard enough to make the walls seem closer. "You're not going to stand on a stage and embarrass this family. You look like a girl." The words struck harder than the hand that never came down. Behind him, Sir Reid hovered in the hallway, frozen. Eliot looked at his twin, waiting for the voice that had always been his quiet rescue. It never came. Reid's eyes fell to the floor, and with that silence, the thread between them frayed. Eliot's set design was reassigned. He didn't go to the showcase. He didn't draw for months. At school, Reid kept his place among the athletes and honor students, while Eliot drifted further into the corners, invisible where it mattered and too visible where it hurt. The distance between them wasn't measured in miles, but in the way they passed each other in the kitchen without speaking. Years later, Eliot would remember that night not as the moment his father's words broke him, but as the moment he learned something more dangerous: silence could cut deeper than cruelty. And yet, even in that hurt, there was a truth waiting to be found. Sometimes the people who fail you in the moment are the same ones carrying battles you can't yet see. If you believe stories can heal the fractures we can't name, and if you want to hear how this twin bond was tested, broken, and rebuilt in ways no one expected, stay with Heart's story, because what comes next will change how you see family forever. Nearly a decade had passed since Eliot and Reid had lived under the same roof. The years had stretched them into separate worlds. Eliot in New York, immersed in the chaos of stage design, building sets that would live and die in the glow of theater lights, and Reid in Boston, wearing the clean white of a doctor's coat, saving lives in the bright sterility of hospitals. Their calls were polite, sparse, always skimming the surface, never daring to stir what lay underneath. That was why Eliot almost didn't pick up when Reid's name lit his phone one Thursday afternoon. The voice on the other end was steady, almost too casual. Reid had been offered a transfer to Los Angeles. He would need a place to stay while finding his own. Eliot's apartment was small for two people, but the request carried an unspoken weight. Against his better judgment, Eliot said yes. When Reid arrived, the first few days felt unexpectedly easy. They ate takeout on the couch, traded half-forgotten memories, even laughed over the quirks of living together again. But soon, the differences emerged like cracks under paint. Eliot's world was layered in sketches scattered across tables, fabric swatches draped over chairs, paint jars left open mid-idea. Reid's world was clean lines, sharp corners, and a place for everything. He would quietly gather Eliot's sketches into neat piles, wipe the coffee table without asking, reorganize the fridge in perfect symmetry. None of it was unkind, but each small adjustment felt like a correction, and each correction reminded Eliot of the silent hallway years ago. Into this unsteady space stepped Olivia, Eliot's closest friend and a photographer who moved through life with the same unapologetic queerness Eliot admired. Olivia had a way of seeing what others missed. Over casual dinners, she drew Reid into conversation, coaxing him into sharing more than his usual short answers. In her lens, she captured the way the brothers sat together, never quite facing each other fully, as if both were wary of seeing too much. Eliot began noticing something else. Some nights, Reid would vanish without a word, returning long after midnight. His shirt would be damp at the collar, his hands faintly trembling as if from exhaustion. And when asked about his evening, he would offer only a vague, just work stuff before disappearing into his room. The suspicion grew one night when Eliot, half awake, heard the soft click of the front door. Hours later, Reid came back, his face pale, his hair disheveled, and his shirt streaked with blood. The sight froze Eliot where he stood in the kitchen doorway. Reid didn't look injured, but his eyes were hollow, his shoulders sagging under a weight Eliot couldn't name. No explanation came. No questions were answered. Eliot carried that image for days, replaying it while painting backdrops or sorting hiding gels, each time feeling the same knot tighten in his chest. He had lived long enough to know that secrecy can be its own kind of danger. Yet he also knew that pressing Reid too soon might slam the door shut for good. In those quiet days of suspicion and unanswered questions, Eliot felt the old divide between them shift, not closing, but changing shape. Sometimes, the distance between people isn't only about what was broken in the past, but about the courage it takes to step close again without knowing what you'll find. That patience, as he would learn, is its own act of care. Eliot's unease grew until it outweighed his restraint. The image of Reid in the doorway that night, shirt stained, eyes dim, had anchored itself too deeply in his mind. One cool evening, when Reid left without a word, Eliot followed at a careful distance. The streets carried him away from their neighborhood of bright storefronts and into quieter blocks where street lamps hummed and shadows lingered. Reid's pace was purposeful, not the wandering of someone lost, but the steady movement of a man who knew exactly where he was going. He stopped at a battered white van parked beside a vacant lot. Its side door slid open, revealing shelves lined with medical supplies. The logo on the panel read, Harborline Outreach. Inside, a small team was already at work. Folding tables had been set up under floodlights powered by a generator. Patients, many thin, unshaven, wrapped in layers despite the mild weather, stood in a loose queue. Some leaned on canes, others held themselves with the brittle posture of people who'd been turned away too many times. From the shadows, Eliot watched his brother slip into the role of healer as though stepping onto a familiar stage. Gloves on, stethoscope ready, Reid moved between patients with quiet efficiency. When a young man lifted his sleeve to reveal a scattering of lesions, Reid's tone softened even further. The table beside them held pamphlets stamped with HIV care and support. Eliot's breath caught. This wasn't some emergency Reid had stumbled into. This was deliberate, practiced, and deeply personal. When Reid finally noticed him at the edge of the lights, surprise flashed in his eyes, but he didn't stop working. It wasn't until the line thinned that Eliot approached. "You never mentioned this," Eliot said, the words heavier than he intended. Reid peeled off his gloves, placing them into a waste bin. "Because it's not about me," he replied. "It's not a story to polish or turn into a cause for applause. It's about them, and they've had enough people turn their lives into performances." Dr. Marcus Lee, a colleague Eliot didn't know, stepped over to introduce himself. Marcus's expression carried the kind of steady warmth that comes from years in work most people avoid. He explained how Reid had been volunteering for months, often on his rare nights off from the hospital. Instead of admiration, Eliot felt a surge of anger. All the nights Reid had stayed silent while their father carved him down with words. All the moments he could have stepped forward and didn't. And now here he was, quietly working in the heart of a community their father had scorned. "You could have stood up for me then," Eliot said, his voice sharp. "You chose silence. But for strangers, you..." He stopped himself, realizing how raw it sounded. Reid's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped back, turned toward the van, and began packing supplies. The conversation was over before it began. He left without another word, and Eliot was left staring at the space where his brother had stood, feeling the past and present collide in a way that left no easy path forward. It is often easier to question someone's timing than to ask why their courage came late. Yet sometimes the reasons people act or fail to act are shaped by wounds we cannot see, and understanding those wounds requires a patience that anger cannot give. Was passed without a word between them. The silence in the apartment had a weight, as if even the air avoided moving between rooms. Eliot buried himself in work, repainting backdrops and recutting fabric late into the night, while Reid kept to his routines, his footsteps measured, his door closing firmly behind him. But it was Olivia who finally pierced the stillness. One afternoon, she found Eliot at her studio, sorting through rolls of canvas for a new set commission. She didn't waste time with small talk. "You think he didn't defend you," she said quietly, "but you weren't there the day he did." She told him what Reid had once shared over coffee, in a tone heavy with memory. Back in high school, a boy had mocked Eliot in the locker room, tossing slurs like stones. Reid stepped in, and the boy's older brother, a senior, had waited outside the gym. By the time Reid made it home, their father was already waiting. The argument was brief, ending with their father's belt in his hand. Reid never spoke of it again. Eliot listened, his chest tightening at the image of his brother standing where he once thought he'd been absent. But the knot in him was still tangled, and he wasn't sure how to undo it. That evening, a text from Olivia jolted him from his workbench. "You need to come to the clinic, now." When Eliot arrived at the mobile clinic site, the scene was chaos. A cluster of men and women stood at the edge of the lot, shouting. Their signs were crude, painted with words that burned into the air. "Stop promoting sin and keep disease out." Bottles clinked against pavement. One rolled to Eliot's feet. Under the harsh floodlights, Reid was crouched beside a patient, shielding them as jeers rose. "Doctor." Marcus was calling for calm, but the protesters pressed closer. Then a glass bottle arced through the air. Without thinking, Eliot stepped forward, planting himself between Reid and the crowd. The glass shattered somewhere behind him, but his eyes stayed locked on the faces in front of him, faces that reminded him, in a sickening flash, of their fathers the night he'd been forbidden from leaving for rehearsal. The noise swelled, but Reid was no longer behind him. He was beside him. This time, he didn't stay silent. His voice cut through the shouting, steady but firm, telling the crowd to back away, to leave. And unlike in their father's house, Reid did not step down when challenged. Security arrived, dispersing the protesters. The lot fell into a tense quiet. Eliot could feel the tremor in his own hands, but the sight of Reid standing tall beside him steadied something inside. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the start of understanding. In moments like these, history has a way of repeating itself, not to wound again, but to offer the chance to rewrite the ending. And when that chance comes, standing beside someone can mean more than any apology ever could. The following week unfolded with an uneasy calm. No one brought up the night at the clinic, but its echoes were everywhere in the way Reid lingered a moment longer in the kitchen before leaving for work, in the way Eliot's voice softened when asking if he'd be home for dinner. The air between them had shifted, and while the silence hadn't vanished, it no longer felt like a wall. One evening, Eliot returned from the theater to find the apartment strangely warm, as if it had been holding a secret all day. On the coffee table was a folder with his name printed in bold letters. Inside were documents, a program outline, letters from a medical board, a certificate of endowment. At the top, in clear black ink, was the title, the Eliot Hartman Scholarship for Inclusive Medicine. Reid emerged from his room, sleeves rolled, the weight of exhaustion visible in his eyes but softened by something gentler. He explained in quiet tones that he had taken the entirety of his hospital performance bonus and placed it into a scholarship fund designed to train future doctors in culturally competent, LGBT-affirming care. His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in it, as though he wasn't sure how the gesture would be received. "I didn't want you to think I only care in the ways you can see." Reid said, This is my way of standing with you. Always." Eliot's throat tightened. For years, he had measured Reid by a single moment of silence, never knowing about the battles his brother had fought beyond his sight. Now, that perspective fractured, letting in the light. The title of the scholarship, his name wasn't about recognition. It was a quiet promise, an unshakable mark that would ripple forward long after both of them were gone. When he finally spoke, Eliot didn't thank him. Instead, he stepped forward and pulled Reid into a brief, fierce embrace, one that carried both apology and acceptance. "Let's make something together," he said. And so they did. Plans formed for a joint event, an art and health benefit that would merge Eliot's stagecraft with Reid's outreach. Theatrical backdrops would rise alongside information booths. Costumes would share space with blood pressure monitors. The night would belong to both worlds, stitched together with the intention of raising funds and awareness. On the evening of the benefit, the theater thrummed with energy. Volunteers from the clinic moved through rows of seats, handing out programs. Spotlights swept across the stage, illuminating displays of painted sets, while the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. At the back, Olivia snapped candid shots of guests laughing and leaning close over shared stories. Eliot and Reid stood side by side at the edge of the stage, scanning the crowd. Neither spoke, but in their shared glance was the quiet recognition that this was no longer about the gap between them, it was about the space they had built together. For the first time, they weren't halves of a broken reflection. They were mirrors holding light for one another. Sometimes, what we think is the end of a relationship is only the midpoint, the moment before the bridge begins to form. And when it does, it can carry more weight than the years that broke it. If you were Eliot, would you have been able to forgive Reid after all this time? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories for more stories that challenge the way we see love, family, and redemption.